and I'm a capital officer with Capital One's community finance team. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I specialize in structuring affordable housing transactions. I get to work with nonprofit and for-profit community development partners to structure affordable housing transactions in the states of California, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado.
Hi, I'm Zach Shore, Director of Development with Panoramic Interests. We are a small housing developer here in the Bay Area. We have projects in Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco. We have about 2,800 units in our pipeline right now. And we've kind of become known for using a lot of modular construction techniques, building, workforce housing, housing for mere mortals here in the Bay Area. And yeah, excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm Karin Brandt. I'm the founder and CEO at Co-Urbanize. We are a technology startup. We're based in Boston, but we work on projects across the country and in Canada. And we are a community engagement solution for development teams to manage community outreach, to avoid some of the misinformation and costly delays that they face. Here in San Francisco, if you're familiar with some of the Nimbyism that goes on, I see a lot of heads nodding. That's the problem that we solve.
Hi, Evan Williams with Capital One. Like Dave, I work in affordable housing, specializing in financing through our partners at Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and FHA, working on everything from new construction to preservation and rehabilitation of existing properties and providing financing to those owners.
So I think our first question today, probably Dave and Evan, you may each want to weigh in on one of the things that is a challenge with affordable housing is the increase in costs, whether it's labor, materials, operational expenses. So what are some of the innovative means of financing, different approaches that are helping to address some of that?
Yeah, certainly. I'm happy to start. Certainly one innovative structure that is becoming increasingly popular in the industry is what is referred to as twinning. And in community finance, the vast majority of transactions that Capital One plays a role in utilize low-income housing tax credits, what are referred to as LIHTCs. For those of you unfamiliar with LIHTCs, it's a federally subsidized program that was created to develop affordable housing. And there's two types of credits. There's what are called 4% tax credits and 9% tax credits. 9% tax credits are known as a more competitive, scarce source, whereas 4% credits, they're a little bit more abundant and are paired with tax-exempt financing. And twinning utilizes both the 4% and the 9% tax credits in a single transaction. Well, for financing of one transaction. So that's becoming increasingly popular.
We're also seeing people approach mixed income developments as a solution to constraints they might face on doing 100% affordable housing. Certain affordable housing developments are constrained in the size that they can be built to, so it'll be typically 40 to 60 units of affordable housing. And by combining that with market rate housing to build a bigger property, you're helping spread the fixed costs of development across more units. You've got an apartment building that makes more sense to manage operationally over the long term. At 100 units, you're staffing it in a similar way as you would with a smaller building. And it's also providing housing that's reflective of the community. So you've got set-aside units for very low-income households, but when people walk down the street and they see this new development in their neighborhood and they are not income qualified, they still got a housing opportunity there. So we've seen that be successful on a lot of fronts, and it's a new challenge for financing. We've got to look more closely at the market dynamics there, the market rent levels, as the new construction that's coming online. But it is a product that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have really embraced, and luckily at Capital One we have some internal tools with being able to study market rate developments and market rents in a neighborhood to help us underwrite those deals.
Well, and some of what you're talking about gets into the, challenge, especially in areas like the Bay Area, where we are now, of not only affordable housing, but the workforce housing. And what are some of the things that are being done to have that workforce housing more plentiful for those who don't qualify for the affordable housing?
For workforce housing, we're really seeing that the emphasis is on preservation. These are often buildings that are serving the community today, and the challenge is to make sure they continue to do so. And Freddie Mac's really led the way with a mezzanine financing program and a credit facility program, both targeting a workforce housing level of 80% AMI. And under those programs, owners are committing to limit their rent increases for the term of the loan, so typically 10 years. And Freddie Mac, in turn, is providing greater certainty of financing, a lower cost of financing that allows an owner to make the investment they need to in the physical plant and still earn an acceptable level of return without increasing rents beyond in a workforce affordable level.
And on the affordable housing side, as it relates to transactions that involve low-income housing tax credits, we're seeing particular state tax credit allocating agencies incentivize transactions to offer 80% AMI units or more market units, so we have a mixed tendency within affordable transactions rather than just purely affordable units.
Yeah, I think for us, first of all, workforce housing here in the Bay Area is kind of loosely defined as 80% area median income to 150% area median income. I think, trying to get subsidy sources for something that's north of 80% AMI income levels is a challenge. And so we've focused a lot more on innovating on the product types we build, like we build co-living, very compact units. We focus on using new technologies like modular construction and other technologies to build it for less, because really, if you break that down in the Bay Area, a family makes about $80,000 here. So the 80% to 150% AMI levels are people that can afford maybe $2,200 to $2,700 in rent for a two-bedroom apartment, which is largely non-existent except for older housing stock. So traditionally that's kind of been where cops, nurses, construction workers live. We're trying to build that with new construction, and in order to do so, our two-bedroom unit, for example, is the size of, say, a luxury studio apartment that you might see in the Bay Area. So it's more compact, thoughtful design, modular construction to build it, and as a result, we can charge lower rents to get it built.
So another question for you, Zach, and talking about innovation, I know part of our previous discussion was on the use of opportunity zones and how, basically you have this preferential tax treatment for certain investments within these distressed areas. How have you seen, or are you seeing opportunity zones being used to try to bring more affordable housing into areas?
Yeah, well, let me start by just defining what it is. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, 2 pages of the 1,500 pages of it were about opportunity zones. An opportunity zone is geographically located in a low income census tract area. And what that enables developers and businesses to do is start something that's called an opportunity fund. This is a conduit for funneling an investor selling one investment and putting it into a new investment in these low income census tract areas. So for us, like building workforce housing, it is like rocket fuel for our projects because we happen to own a lot of land in these low-income census tract areas. And basically the way it works is, to put it in perspective, I'll just talk about a project in West Oakland that we have. It's 1,032 units. We will start an opportunity fund for that project, and an investor can sell, say, $1 million in Google stock and roll it into our project tax-free. After 7 years, the basis of that investment steps up 15%. So backdated 7 years, they pay their capital gains that were waived at day one on the 85% of that $1 million. And then after 10 years, there's no capital gains charged on the upside of that investment. So what that does is it enables a lot of these stock owners to transfer to a more, reliable, long-term patient equity source, like a real estate development deal in a growth area. And so it's really, for us, it's serving as kind of the gap financing that we really need to get these projects off the ground. We have trouble competing with luxury developers that might have like a very sought after piece of land and a project today, whereas ours takes more of a longer view in a growth area. And so this program really enables us to source money and utilize that money to fund these deals.
Great. So another part of innovation is technology. We're near Silicon Valley where so much is happening. One of the things that we see a lot with affordable housing is the Nimbyism that you brought up. You see projects that are slowed or even stopped for years on end because of public pushback. And I'm curious, Karin, what you saw as the need that existed that led to creating Co-Urbanize and how that tool is addressing that.
Sure. So my background is actually in city planning. So I always say I went to a lot of public meetings. And I think it's fair to say planners and developers often go into the industry because you want to create change. And it was really frustrating because it felt like oftentimes the people who are more likely to show up at a meeting were more opposed to change, and they didn't want to see change happen. So it takes a long time to get things done. And I really wanted to create a tool to help development teams reach all of the other people out in the community who I think are supportive of change, but might not have the privilege of time to go to a 3-hour community meeting on a Tuesday night. So that's where the idea from Co-Urbanize came about.
And it's led to partnerships, as with Capital One.
Yeah, so what we're seeing, we work with both real estate developers and cities on their planning projects. And particularly with affordable housing, we're seeing an increasing amount of Nimbyism that's slowing down or even stopping projects from being built. So we've worked with Capital One on a strategic partnership to provide Co-Urbanize to affordable housing developers to help them overcome some of the misinformation and Nimbyism that slows their projects down. So one example of this is a project in Chicago in the Jefferson Park area, where the developer had gotten their tax credit application denied, and they had to go back to the community, revise their plans. They started using Co-Urbanize to be able to reach some of those more silent supporters to get more positive feedback on the project. And this fall, they were able to get approval from the Chicago Planning Commission, and now they're going to be applying for tax credits with a much stronger application with community support behind it.
That's great. So looking at the technology that is coming into play, we see technology that's helping with communication, that's streamlining logistics or advancing the construction process. What do you see as the applications that are coming into use that are really exciting, that really could create some change?
Yeah, I think there's just enormous opportunity in development for technology to provide more efficiencies and savings. We think about it at Co-Urbanize as we're facilitating external communication, and the next product development that we have is around internal communication. What we hear from developers is that they're managing these huge projects in Excel and Outlook. So you can imagine that's not super efficient. And that's what's happening at Courbanize. When I look out at the industry, a couple weeks ago I heard some folks from WeWork talking about how they're approaching development differently. And what I think is really fascinating is they've taken some of the approaches from a tech company and a development company and are marrying them, and they're creating more integrated design build. So removing a lot of the decision-making steps and actually the people involved along the way to create enormous efficiencies from the time of project inception to construction. One example of that is all of the glass inside of WeWork. They have that all at one particular company that they now own. So they have one sourcing of all of the materials, and they're doing that across each step of the process.
So Zach, you mentioned modular construction. I know there's other technology that Panoramic Interest puts to use. What are some ways that you're using technology to speed the processing? Can you tell us more about what you're doing with modular construction?
Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, we're located here in the Bay Area, which really helps us access talent, but also in the Bay Area, construction costs since 2010 have gone up 80%. Our construction costs today on a gross square foot basis are $450 a foot, while Phoenix is $185 a foot, LA is $330 a foot. As a result, this is like a hotbed for innovation in construction technology because you can actually utilize these new technologies and save early on in the process, whereas, with modular construction, for example, a modular project, about $160 of the construction cost is spent in a factory setting and then set on site. So a place like Phoenix would be non-applicable because you wouldn't get much savings, whereas in the Bay Area, we're able to get a lot of savings using modular construction. For us, we've partnered with a shipping container manufacturer and set up a plant building steel modular construction. And we're starting to build all of our units that way. And accessing a lot of the new technology, like Karen was saying, building information modeling, we're able to build our housing more akin to the auto manufacturing industry. When you look at auto manufacturing, Toyota will spend $1 billion setting up the production line for a Prius. And then that's why a Prius costs $35,000 to build. If they kind of like purpose built every single Prius the way the consumer wanted it, that same Prius would cost $350,000 to build. So yeah, I'd say we're really standardizing a lot of our unit types, putting it in a factory setting, combining it with like the technology that's finally here in construction. It's probably the last industry to not innovate. Like we're still building buildings today like we were 100 years ago. If you go walk around the city and look at how they're being constructed, it's part by part construction. That's the same way the Empire State Building was built, in 1920s. So yeah, it's been a very interesting time for construction here, and I think that the Bay Area is kind of setting a precedent that will be, carried through to the rest of the country as their construction costs rise. So.
I'm curious if the changes in construction that are changing the timelines, does that change things on the financing end in terms of like, do you do things differently if a project is modular, or do those different vehicles hold no matter how the developer is approaching the project?
That's a great point. On modular construction, one of the key advantages besides cost savings is the potential for a faster timeline. And if you think about a real estate development, there's both debt financing and equity financing. The equity financing for new construction is usually requiring a higher return, as you would expect, for new development. So the shorter amount of time you can have, let's say someone wants a 20% return, Well, it's a lot easier to accomplish that for 1 year or 1.5 years versus a 4-year construction timeline, right? So if you can accelerate that construction process, you're actually giving yourself a lot of savings on the equity side, or potential savings, and just making it a more attractive development. You've got a similar dynamic on the debt financing, where the more time you add, the more uncertainty you create in terms of what your long-term interest rates and what your long-term financing is going to be. And if you want to be able to lock in an interest rate 2 years out, maybe that is 0.4%. If you want to lock it 4 years in advance, that's probably just not available, right, or at any cost. So I think by speeding up that timeline, you add a lot of certainty, and it helps make financing more available for different arrangements.
Yeah, I think that, from our perspective, it's been a challenge to get financing for modular construction. I think that banks largely like plain vanilla processes to put deals together because they do risk assessment, and until today, the modular construction industry has been largely shaky startups in the industry that weren't well capitalized. And so when you get a bank to go tour that factory and they realize that maybe that factory won't be there tomorrow, they start getting second thoughts about loaning the money. They're also, just the whole lending industry is very used to, an assessor coming through and looking at, in real terms, like what's happening on a construction site. And it's taken a while for them to wrap their head around, like, touring a factory and acknowledging the fact that that's going to a construction site. And then for us, like, some of our work is happening overseas, and we have not really been able to approach the construction lending industry for that stuff. Like, so our deals are kind of interesting. We almost finance like an international trade deal and a construction project, and we combine the two. And so it creates layers and a different capital stack than a project is used to. But I do think that they're coming around, and you're starting to see large shops come online with a lot of financing, like Katera, like Rad Urban here in San Francisco, who just raised $25 million. So you're starting to see some of these manufacturers come online that are going to be around, maybe 10 years from today because of how they're capitalized. And so I think that that's really helping, the banks buy into the concept.
So one of the things with affordable housing is we're talking a lot about the buildings, but it's also what's going on inside of those buildings. And so, Dave, I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about grant support for some of the services provided in certain affordable housing projects.
Yeah, certainly. So this is kind of more of, for me at least, the neater aspect of what we get to do in the affordable housing industry beyond structuring the financing, because everyone in the affordable housing industry has a reason for why they do what they do every day and why they've stuck in this industry. And one of the unique products that Capital One has to offer to some of our nonprofit development partners is what we call a social purpose grant. And the intent of the social purpose grant is to help the residents of the buildings that Capital One Community Finance is financing. And one example of a transaction we've recently financed is with the Boston Home organization in Boston, Massachusetts. The Boston Home organization has been based in Boston for over 100 years, and they're experts in servicing individuals with chronic illnesses. And one of my colleagues based in Boston met with this organization some time ago, and where they expressed that a particular segment of their population they've been observing was suffering from chronic neurological disorders such as multiple sclerosis. And so after hearing this story of the Boston Home and their desire to build a building specifically for individuals with chronic neurological disorders, we were able to offer social purpose grant support to the Boston Home organization to provide where they had originally intended a part-time social services coordinator for this population, to increase it to a full-time social service coordinator.
We're starting to see additional scale come to the services space, where Fannie Mae's created an enhanced resident services program targeting social services at properties. They help pay for those social services through a reduced interest rate after they qualify both the developer and that specific project. And what they're really hoping to do, it's two fronts, both making an impact in specific communities and with specific developments, but also really creating a framework to institutionalize it. People, I think from experience, know that social services, everything from working with chronically homeless populations to after-school services to assistance filing income taxes, things like that, they have positive effects for their residents. They have positive effects for the community, but to really build sustainable funding over time, you've got to show what those positive impacts are. So I think they're just, the industry is just is starting down that path of developing a consistent framework to really measure the impact those services have.
So are we anticipating that we're going to see more of these services incorporated into affordable housing projects and perhaps even some workforce housing, more of that community aspect?
I think definitely. I think the vast majority of soft financing sources provided by municipalities, whether it be states, cities, or counties, that is existing, is targeting at the lower income end of the spectrum, such as the chronically homeless individuals, and those specific populations necessitate the provision of supportive services.
I'm curious, Zach, from your side of things, are you seeing more demand within the projects that you're doing for spaces that are maybe a little more community facing, as opposed to something that's solely for the residents, although the residents would benefit from it, that kind of fits with some of these services?
Yeah, I think that our projects, we do actually have a couple co-living projects going right now, which is kind of a really hot topic here in the Bay Area, where you kind of provide either a bedroom or a very, very small compact unit with a lot of shared amenities. There seems to be a huge demand for that, whether it's We Live, Star City, a number of other companies that build that stuff here. I think that there is demand for that, like kind of a one-stop shop. I don't know if it's a permanent solution, though, here in the Bay Area. It seems to me like it's a convenience thing for younger folks that want to fill out an e-lease online that are moving here for a job, and so I think it definitely serves a purpose. But we really focus on our actual housing projects that aren't co-living, on just focusing on one amenity, which is price. We just try to build the unit as efficiently as possible so as to charge lower rents, because nobody's really doing that, and that to us is the biggest opportunity here, is just really trying to crack the nut of how to get a lot of housing built that's not luxury and super expensive. And as far as amenities goes, we don't provide, dog, bath services, pools on the roof. We don't do any of that stuff. Our amenities price. We have nice roof decks. We always buy a piece of land in a very transit-oriented development location, and all of our amenities are really around the building. They're the city. I think it started. A lot of developers are neglecting the fact that San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley are excellent cities to be and spend time, and they're trying to provide pool tables and kind of almost ridiculous amenities that when I tour these buildings, I don't see anybody actually using those spaces. And I think, why didn't they just build housing right there and encourage people to go out and go to restaurants and hang out in parks, stuff like that. I went on a tangent there, but I think,
It all fits together.
yeah.
So, Karin, I'm curious, kind of on the topic of what a project brings to the community, what you've seen through Co-Urbanize, what are people focusing on? What is kind of causing that shift when there's those discussions, when there's a concern that Nimbyism may be a challenge for a project? What are the things that are helping change people's minds about that coming in?
Yeah, I think what changes people's minds is the developer really saying, these are the facts of the project, making information accessible, and then also really listening. So telling people that they do have questions for the community and making it clear where the community can provide valuable input. And some examples of this are, sometimes there is a park or more open space area, and so asking the community how they want to use that, what types of activities would they like to see there, if there is a community space, what should be there, how people want to use that, and retail, I think, is the number one topic that people comment on Co-Urbanize. People want to make sure that that first floor is really active and that it's going to be leveraged. We see lots of comments about use this local company or that local company. And those are things that the developer can meaningfully respond to, whereas sometimes the height or the affordability levels might be areas where there is less wiggle room.
Yeah, I think, our projects our whole business is housing. That's how we make our money. On the ground floor, we always dedicate it to retail space, but we really focus on like the local aspect and getting the right shop in there. And so in our pro formas, we basically pencil free rent in that retail space so that we can find the right tenants and the right mix, because that's really kind of our amenity, and that's like what the community wants, is the right fit for that neighborhood and what it needs, whether it's essential services, a place to hang out, whether we allocate a piece of land for a park. Like, we try to really build our projects to where we get the density of housing we need to make it work, and then we can kind of give back with that. And then it benefits our residents, but it also benefits the community to a large extent.
So I know we've gone through several of the things done to address certain challenges. I'd be curious to hear from each of you what you see as the biggest challenge facing affordable housing right now. What is really the thing that is driving a lot of the innovation going on? Perhaps ways that those could be addressed that maybe aren't being addressed right now. So I know it's a little bit of an off-the-cuff question, but I was curious if each of you could give your insight on that. So.
For me, the biggest challenge facing affordable housing is housing affordability at large, right? So you've got a lot of communities, a lot of major cities where you've seen a lot of economic growth, and for whatever reason, whether it's geography or zoning or the planning process or the economics of the market or construction costs, all those things, the housing hasn't been there to support the growth in the economy in that market. And so what you're seeing is, although some places have had wage growth, some places haven't, in the most dynamic economies, San Francisco especially, you're seeing a tremendous cost in the whole community in rising housing costs, right? So people are starting to question, do we even want, XYZ tech company expanding down the street, because it's just going to create stress in my household over the cost of rent, the cost of buying my first home. So ironically, that's also what's created the best opportunity. It's a very solvable problem. Zoning is a public process. approving individual real estate developments, I think now has a different lens to it, which is not only do we want, XYZ building on this corner and at this height and, serving these income levels, but this building on this street corner is going to be part of the solution to providing housing for our region. So that's been, but across the board, if you look at the statistics, people are spending more of their income on rent than they have any time in the past 10 years. So that's the biggest challenge, and it really takes both affordable housing, workforce housing, market rate housing to solve that problem.
I would echo everything Evan just covered. He covered quite a swath of issues that we're facing in our community, and I would say that it's evident that we as citizens recognize that, because in the last two major elections, we've seen voters approve tax initiatives in many major metros to tax themselves to provide more financing, to close the gap to construct affordable housing, because it truly does come down to the rents and making the deal pencil so it can remain affordable in perpetuity.
Yeah, to me, the biggest challenge is just the structure and red tape around building affordable housing. So, first big picture, it's the structure of affordable housing in the U.S. is 85% of all money that goes towards affordable housing goes to home ownership in the form of 1031 exchanges and mortgage interest tax deductions. And then that leaves 15% for renters. And it seems to me like the rental housing is really what we need. You're starting to see a real flip in home ownership rates that has continued through a couple downturns now, which tells you that we really need to support more, rental housing to help people save money and actually be able to buy. And so that's a challenge. And then the little bit of subsidy that is there, which is the 15% in the form of low-income housing tax credits and bond money, it's very difficult to get because there's not much of it. And once you do get it, to me, it's there's just so much red tape that keeps getting layered on to building the housing. So, you need to, here in the Bay Area, when you gather all your subsidy money from your 10 sources to build a low-income project, you need to pay prevailing wage, which makes your construction costs 30% more expensive. You need to build it to a different building code for accessibility standards from Chapter 11A to 11B. So you have to build bigger, bulkier units because of the red tape, and you need to go through secondary and tertiary plan reviews, and all this stuff comes at a cost. So it comes at a cost to track all the money from 10 sources instead of 2, from public to private. It costs money to do all these secondary and tertiary reviews and to build these bigger units and to syndicate the credits. So that's kind of why we've sort of opted into more just affordable by design buildings, and we just build the required inclusionary housing and focus on, getting it built for a lower cost. So I think a lot of that red tape kind of needs to be unraveled and stripped away from these affordable housing deals, because there's no point in getting subsidy that saves you, say, 30% if you're just going to spend 30% more money to get it built after getting the subsidy.
I think one of the biggest challenges is really simply political will to approve and finance affordable housing. We see it in a lot of places across the country where communities that may consider themselves progressive, when an affordable housing development comes to their neighborhood, they become NIMBYs. And some of the approval boards have a hard time rationalizing and justifying the decision to approve that much needed affordable housing. So ways to think about making it easier for affordable housing to get approved, making it easier for the silent supporters or the YIMBYs to be able to come out and support that. And then other opportunities to provide more financing that's more accessible. And I think it's not just affordable housing, but as Zach mentioned, market rate development that has an inclusionary component to it that would ease some of the burden on the affordability levels across the market.
So are we seeing some of that political will start to shift? You mentioned voters voting in favor of funding for affordable housing. Here in San Francisco, the mayor and city council have been very focused on wanting to bring in modular construction and really boost the affordable housing stock in the area. So are we starting to see that shift because so many people are paying so much for their housing costs at this point?
I can speak mostly to what I've seen locally out on the East Coast in New York City specifically. I mean, I think at one point you had a party that was named "The Rent is Too Damn High," so there's been a consensus that rent is a big issue for everybody. But at the same time, it wasn't sort of clear what people wanted in that, if you have a neighborhood that is experiencing a lot of new development, what does that mean for the people who have lived there the last 30 years and feel like they're priced out of these new developments? So New York has really had as much trouble grappling with how to deal with new construction and how to provide housing as any other market, but I think they've started to form a consensus around the idea that it is needed. You are going to have to build, you can't solve this problem by keeping things the same, but at the same time, creating a consensus around how to do that. Where are the areas that are appropriate to add density, usually around transit, certain sort of broader corridors in terms of the streetscape, and providing housing at multiple income levels. So there's kind of housing opportunities created for all types of households.
I would just echo that. I think some of the downtown areas have been wrapping their heads around it. But where a lot of new development and affordable housing development is happening is in those outer rings, in neighborhoods where they haven't seen that type of change before. The idea of rentals or apartments is very foreign and scary and new. And that's where a lot of new change is going to be concentrated.
Yeah, I think that cities and state of California and federally, I think everyone's starting to embrace it, but I think they're focusing again a little bit more on the red tape and little conduits we can do. To me, the Bay Area is 40 years underbuilt. We created since 2013 800,000 jobs and built 57,000 units of housing. It makes no sense. Everyone needs to embrace upzoning, transit corridors, and building housing because, believe it or not, the result of that is going to be vibrant retail and benefits for all the community. We need to, funnel these development projects into the right areas. I think a lot of the Nimbyism is kind of created from this age-old sense of, I don't want this big behemoth project in my single-family neighborhood, but that doesn't need to happen. I think we need to get behind ballot measures that manage growth appropriately, but really encourage producing housing units, because that's why rent is so high in this town and other towns. It's the housing's just not getting built, and people need to get educated on it. As far as the modular thing goes, though, it's modular housing. It's a very sensitive topic here in San Francisco with the labor unions and politicians. They seem to want modular construction, but they want the modular plant to be within San Francisco city limits, which is a 7-by-7 mile area, and there's no land to even build housing on, but they want a massive modular plant. The modular plant where we build is 10 acres. It's you can't build it in San Francisco, but they're kind of putting down their foot and saying it's got to be built here. And so unfortunately, politically, that seems to be what's being supported just because of one interest group saying they want that, but that makes no sense. So to me, a lot of it's just logical, and it seems just ballot measures keep being created to kind of almost support the wrong thing, and then kill a good idea before it even starts, which that's almost more of a California problem than anything else, but yeah.
I've heard transit a couple of times in there, properties near transit. You'd mentioned transit-oriented previously. In the Bay Area, we've got BART with these plans for building on its property, which not only, helps with housing, but also can, hopefully help with keeping commuters going in different directions to home and office and that sort of thing. Is transit going to be or already a key part of affordable housing construction in, I don't know, cities, including the Bay Area, but throughout the U.S.? Is that going to be a key part of growing affordable housing going forward?
I think there's more recognition. I don't know that we've totally cracked the code in terms of changing the way the affordable housing industry delivers housing, right? We still go by some pretty old rules of thumb that were established decades ago. But at the same time, so we may look at, this unit, if they charge $1,000 rent, they're just as affordable over a subway station or a transit stop as another property that charges $1,000 in rent, but requires you to drive everywhere. So the affordable housing industry might not be capturing that, but at the same time, I think it's been recognized by everyone in the housing industry that transit is where you want to build, right? And that helps get support behind the idea of not adding car trips and, where are the areas that it is smart to build? And transit's usually the answer to that.
Yeah, and in other ways, from an operational standpoint, promoting the use of transit through provision of bus passes to your residents, et cetera. In many states, they incentivize TOD development through their tax credit applications in the LIHTC program.
Yeah, you can't build meaningful density housing without good transit. I think it starts with transit to me. Like when we look at sites, we build on, our sites are on BART or on a Muni line. The Bay Area, locally needs to get it together and, either dig a subway down Geary Boulevard or put a bus rapid transit system or something and then upzone that area. But you can't just upzone Geary Boulevard, for example, without having good transit because it's not there right now and nobody will move there. And so, yeah, I think it's all about transit. I think it's less, though, like on developers incentivizing it, with giving people free transit and the city just, spending the money up front. It's like you go to these other countries like London, you don't wait more than 30 seconds for a subway, you know what I mean? Going from stop to stop here, it's 20 minutes. It's confusing to me, like why we can't just get it together on the transit side of things. Yeah.
Seattle is one of the cities that's undergoing this right now, and they're taking a really interesting approach to look at future planning for new stations and making sure that they are TOD and that they have a lot of affordable housing right now. So they're running a lot of community processes and building that vision for the future of how they're going to grow.
I thought we'd take a minute to see if there was a question from our local audience. Yes? Oh, there's a microphone coming to you.
I can get you the mic here.
Hi, the question is for you. I didn't catch your name.
Karen?
Karen, let me make sure I heard you correctly. You said that that when you're looking at building, or when they're looking at building affordable housing, sometimes in a progressive neighborhood, that sometimes there's resistance. Could you talk a little bit about what some of those fears are that you've encountered, and does your organization address those fears?
Yeah, so what I mean by that is I like to use this phrase that everybody becomes an environmentalist when an affordable housing project comes to the neighborhood, or a preservationist. They want to preserve that vacant parking lot, or they want to preserve that vacant land rather than create more traffic, create more burden on the schools. It's almost any other excuse except for I don't want those people to live next to me. And so we think about it as chipping away at a lot of misinformation and the misconceptions people actually have about affordable housing, to talk about what it is and what the benefits are for everybody. So our organization is a technology tool that the development teams use to communicate back and forth with the community members. So we're not actually the ones telling people about the facts of the project, but we're creating the two-way dialogue to help the development teams correct misinformation and making sure that when they come to the next meeting, things haven't gone sideways outside on social media and things like that.
Yeah, that was the first time I've heard the term Nimbyism, actually, in this talk, and I had to Google it while you guys were talking. But at least during this election in Oakland, there was a lot of things, a lot of measures on the ballot for affordable housing, and all of them all the cost of it fell solely on homeowners through parcel taxes and things like that. There was, I think, 6 of them on the ballot. And a couple of them passed and a couple of them got voted down. And I really like the idea of like this privatized affordable housing. And I'm wondering, is there another source of money for affordable housing? And I get the idea that the NIMBYism maybe comes from, any other excuse besides I don't want these people living next to me. But there's also this other side that like, I think that people struggling to like afford their first home and things like that, and then seeing maybe $1,000 tax increase the very next year also vote down those things. And it's really difficult for them to get behind them when that's where the money for this kind of stuff comes from. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas about where else that money could come from. Or anybody.
Yeah, so it's both sides. Affordable housing, Zach hit the nail on the head. There is a higher level of structuring. There's an application process. It takes longer to get funding. It's a different, in terms of undertaking a development, it's a different challenge that brings with it some costs, right? So there's no sort of free version, but I think you have seen municipalities get more innovative about how they approach that. Municipalities can write a check to offset some of those costs. And first of all, there is a lot of federal financing, or there is federal financing, which is sort of the primary tool most cities and developers use. But cities can support it monetarily by writing a check or developing a program to do loans with below market interest rates. But they also can impact the cost through a lot of policies. So we've seen inclusionary housing become much more common nationwide. And also the concept tied with that of providing a density bonus. So if you're building 100 units of market rate development, maybe the city would offer you the opportunity to build 130 units and have 20% of them be affordable. So you're getting some additional market rate units and additional affordable units. That's not free in the sense that it comes at greater density, greater building height. It may increase the cost of the building, so it depends on where you're building and the type of building. So there's no free lunch, but there are ways to incentivize affordable housing without directly funding it either through policies.
I just wanted to go back to modular housing or modular components. And my question is, how far along are cities and insurance companies and some of those ancillary components that need to be in place for financing for those kinds of things? So how far along are cities in accepting that and building codes, all of those kinds of things? And the insurance companies, are they there, particularly earthquake in California?
So, not far along. We built the first modular construction project in San Francisco in 2013. And so not much time has lapsed since then. Modular construction as a whole is managed by the state. 37 states in the US manage the modular construction themselves, including California. And so HCD, Housing Community Development, manages it, and they have programs in place to educate these cities and create ordinances to allow it, but it's always a struggle. I mean, we go into the building department, we explain what we're doing, and we bring in state representatives to explain it. Because I think it's kind of daunting to local jurisdictions to see something different, you know? So the way it works is anything that happens in a factory is reviewed by the state of California through third-party inspectors, and then it's largely driven to the local site where the local jurisdiction accepts it, and they do all the inspections from there. And so it's a lot of hand-holding, a lot of, you know, education and outreach, trying to get them up to speed on it. And I think it's the same with banking. I think it's kind of funny, like modular construction is not a new concept, but it has never grown. So like, I think in the US right now, 3% of construction is modular. If you look at Sweden, it's like 40%. And so it's never really proliferated here, but I think that given the supporting technology that's out there today, that's starting to happen. So I think we're actually starting to see a lot more acceptance from insurance companies, from, you know, these are not, you know, completely outside the box processes we're using to construct these buildings. We're largely doing it the same, just under a roof someplace in a controlled environment where it's safer and easier to work on the building, and then transporting it to a site and assembling it. And so, yeah, a lot of it's just them wrapping their heads around it, seeing it make sense and embracing it. The labor contracts at a lot of these building departments and cities don't help because they feel like their jobs are being threatened outsourcing it to the state. And so, yeah, it gets very intertwined and complicated politically. And so it's kind of a long road ahead, I would say, with working modular construction into mainstream.
I'm wondering what kind of effect you see the dissolution of redevelopment agencies in California a few years ago, what effect that may have had on the development of affordable housing?
Yeah, well, certainly it stalled a fair amount of developments, and there was a blip in production for quite some time, and I think we've been working to get back to those levels of historical production. Recently, with corporate tax reform, we've sort of hit another blip, but I believe that as we were discussing earlier, the measures that many jurisdictions are passing, that we're passing as voters, is to help offset and get back to some of those historical production levels, because we see the need for more affordable housing.
I know there's a project that just started on Co-Urbanize in South San Francisco, the PUC site, which is a site where the former redevelopment authority had owned, and they put the land through a disposition and RFP process, and now they are building a mix of incomes, including affordable housing, being proposed on that site. So I think it's a long process as well to kind of get back.
Can you guys talk more about the role of Prop 13 in California and its role in maybe disincentivizing people to build housing across the board? Because I could see how if I were to finally afford a house and I go from YIMBY to buying a house, I could immediately go to NIMBY just because of the economic incentives at play. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought it up. It wouldn't be a panel in California if that topic wasn't brought up.
Do you want to take that, or?
Well,
I'm happy to talk about it a little bit. Yeah, I think that, Prop 13 is a double-edged sword, right? Like, all this legislation, since it went into effect, whatever it was, like, was it 79 or something that went in? Has now layered on top of it, but I don't know, I just think about it, it's like, it's good for your parents, but it's not good for you, and it might be good for you once you buy a home, but until you do, it's kind of prohibiting you from doing so. So it was just one of those policies that really, I mean, it's great for a baby boomer right now that's living in their home and pays very little property tax, and they can stay in their home and age in place, and that's great. But, it's a challenge for everybody else because we don't have the necessary funding we need to support the local economy.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely a double-edged sword because for most of us, buying a home is going to be the largest financial decision you make in your life. And when you're making that decision, when you're getting into that decision, what your monthly payment is going to be for the next 15 to 30 years is one of the biggest aspects of that decision. And so from a positive standpoint, having Prop 13 makes a lot of sense because it minimizes the fluctuation in what your cash outlay is going to be on a monthly basis. So it helps provide stability for you as a housing owner. However, on the flip side, as home values continue to increase, as our economies continue to grow, with that cap on your annual property tax increases, definitely the tax revenue flow to support services for the community can falter if with a prolonged cap on tax increases.
Yeah, I think in some ways it does incentivize Nimbyism. Property tax it essentially caps the property tax, and the property tax base is what provides for the public goods. So transportation, public transportation, schools, and that starts to affect the most marginalized populations.
Somebody mentioned that the vast majority of funding for affordable housing goes towards home ownership rather than rental. Do you guys have an opinion on the, effectiveness of that to get people, into a better financial position if they were to purchase a discounted, home in a GPMR program rather than just getting them into an affordable rental position?
Yeah, I think it's just, to me, it's just a similar outcome to Prop 13 in a way. It's great that we've, incentivized and supported the backbone of the American dream, which is home ownership, which goes back to, World War II. But, I think as a result, like the people that are most in need end up suffering, right? Like if 15% of the subsidy for housing is going to rental, anyone in the low income quadrant is renting their home, they don't own it. And it feels unfair to me, and it seems like it needs readjustment, like at least 70-30, maybe not 50-50, but it needs to be reassessed. Whether it's 1031 exchanges or, the mortgage interest, which actually changed recently to an extent, $750,000 or more, you don't get the deduction. It seems like it needs to be assessed more. And we really need to figure out a way to provide affordable rental housing, because that's how you get people off the streets and into supportive housing. That's rental housing at its core. So, yeah, that's what I'd say.
So we have time for one more question, and I'll take it from online. This is from Daniel Cunningham, who's watching from the DC area. He'd like to know what you would say to Secretary Carson at HUD that you would like to see his team do in terms of affordable housing.
I'll take a shot at that. We work with HUD closely in their FHA financing program, and then a lot of affordable housing benefits from subsidies from HUD. I think the sort of fundamental thing we see is on two fronts, continuing to support Section 8 housing with adequate funding, which Congress has continued to support, and then and realizing that that is in many ways an investment in housing security for households that would not have means of getting housing otherwise. And then they've actually made huge strides in the last 10 years. FHA has become a much bigger source of financing for affordable housing, so kind of continuing that good work on a technical level to make sure FHA is there to support affordable housing.
Great. Well, I thank you all for your time. I think we had a great panel today with lots of good insight on affordable housing. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.